Travis Boone, a decorated combat veteran who lost part of his leg during his final deployment, has spent 2 years saving to take his 7-year-old daughter Hazel in first class to the beach, where they will scatter the ashes of his late wife Mara. After boarding an airline gate agent humiliates them by taking away their paid first-class seats to accommodate a wealthy executive. Refusing to upset Hazel, Travis quietly accepts the injustice until Captain Ed Calder unexpectedly leaves the cockpit, publicly salutes Travis, restores their seats, and demands an apology. During the flight, Captain Calder reveals that Travis unknowingly saved his son's life by rescuing him from a burning military vehicle during the battle in which Travis lost his leg. Deeply grateful, the captain honors him before the passengers, changing everyone's perception. The airline later refunds the trip, grants Travis and Hazel lifetime first-class travel benefits, and apologizes, while Travis requests mercy for the gate agent instead of punishment. Father and daughter fulfill Mara's final wish by scattering her ashes at the ocean, finding peace together. They continue returning to the beach each year, where the Boone and Calder families remain forever connected by the sacrifice that saved a life and inspired lasting gratitude. They pulled my daughter and me out of our first-class seats in front of the whole plane, made us stand up, gather our things, and walk back down the aisle, past every staring face to 2 middle seats in the very last row by the lavatory, because somebody more important than a limping man and his 7-year-old needed our spots. I didn't argue. I'd learned a long time ago in a place a lot harder than an airplane that you can lose your seat and still keep your dignity. And I wasn't about to let my little girl see her daddy make a scene. So I picked up our bags and I took Hazel's hand and we started the long walk to the back. And that's when the cockpit door opened and the captain stepped out. And in front of all 300 passengers, this gray-haired airline captain in his crisp uniform looked right at me. And he came to attention. And he raised his hand in a slow, sharp salute. And he held it. And the whole plane went dead silent. Because nobody, not me, not the gate agents who'd humiliated us, not one single person on that aircraft understood yet why the captain of the flight was standing in the aisle saluting the limping man they'd just thrown out of first class. I'm going to tell you the whole story, every bit of it. And I promise you it's worth the trip. But do this one small thing for me before we push back from the gate. If you're the kind of person who still believes the quiet ones, the overlooked ones, the folks who never ask for a thing, ought to be honored when nobody's looking, then tap that subscribe button right now and buckle in next to me. That's the whole fare. Now let me take you back to the gate and tell you how a man like me ended up in first class in the first place, and why it mattered so much that they took it away. My name is Travis Boone. I'm 41 years old. And I'll tell you up front because it matters to the story that I'm a veteran. I did 3 tours overseas, and I came home from the last one missing most of my left leg below the knee, and with a back full of hardware and a few other souvenirs the doctors are still keeping an eye on. I walk with a cane on good days, and worse than that on bad ones. I don't lead with any of this normally. I'm not one of those fellows who needs everybody to know. I did my job. A lot of better men than me didn't come home to do anything at all, and I figure the least I can do is not make a big production out of having survived. So if you'd seen me at that gate, you'd have just seen a tired-looking man in a flannel shirt with a cane and a kid, and you'd have had no idea. And that's exactly how I like it. There's a thing nobody tells you about coming home from a war with pieces missing. You expect in some childish corner of your heart that the world will somehow know. That people will look at you and understand what it cost the way they would if you came home in a parade. But there are no parades for most of us. You just come home and you heal as much as you're going to, and you go to the grocery store and the gas station and the school pickup line on a leg made of carbon fiber, and not one single soul has the first idea. The cashier's impatient with you because you're slow on the stairs. The fellow behind you in line sighs because you're holding things up. And you learn fast that the world doesn't owe you a thank you, and mostly isn't going to give you one, and that the only people who truly understand are the ones who were there, most of whom you can't call anymore. So you make your peace with being invisible. You tell yourself it doesn't sting, and most days it doesn't. But I won't pretend there wasn't a part of me walking the aisle of that plane that had forgotten what it felt like to be seen at all. I'm a single dad. My daughter's name is Hazel. She's 7, and she is the whole entire reason my heart keeps beating. Her mother, my wife, Mara, passed 2 years ago. Cancer. We'd been together since we were 19 years old. She waited for me through 3 deployments. She was the one who taught me how to live again when I came home broken. And then the one war I couldn't do a thing to protect her from took her anyway. In 11 months while I stood there useless. That's the cruelest joke life ever played on me. And I've had a few played on me. I trained my whole adult life to protect people. I went back into fire for strangers. When the one person I loved most in this world got sick, there was not one single thing in all my training, all my hard-won toughness that could do her a lick of good. I couldn't carry her out of that. I couldn't go back in after her. I just had to sit in a chair by a hospital bed and watch the strongest, kindest person I ever knew get smaller and smaller, and hold her hand and lie to her a little at the end about how she looked because she still cared how she looked even then, which is the kind of brave I'll never be. Mara was the one who put me back together when I came home in pieces, you understand? She was the one who'd find me at 3 o'clock in the morning sitting in the dark, and she wouldn't say a word. She'd just sit down next to me and put her head on my shoulder until the worst of it passed. She saved me a lot more times than I ever saved anybody, and I couldn't save her even once. A man doesn't get over that. He just learns to carry it. And to be a good daddy anyway, because there's a little girl who needs her breakfast. So it's been Hazel and me ever since. A wounded old soldier and a little girl figuring it out together one day at a time. Now I need to tell you why we were on that plane and why it was first class. Because if you don't understand that, you won't understand why it cut the way it did. Mara grew up on the coast. The ocean was her whole heart. She used to say the sound of the waves was the only thing that ever really quieted her mind. When we got married, dirt poor, we drove to that coast for our honeymoon and slept in the truck because we couldn't afford a room. And we sat on that beach all night. And she said someday we'd come back with our kids. We never got the chance, the 2 of us. And before she passed, she asked me for one thing. She asked me to take Hazel to that beach someday when she was old enough to remember it, and to let the ocean she loved meet the little girl she made, and to bring her along a little of her so she could go home to the water one last time. So that's what this trip was. I was taking my daughter across the country to scatter her mother's ashes on the beach, where her mother and I fell in love. That's what was in the carry-on I was holding so carefully. That's why we were flying. And here's why it was first class, which I know is the part that doesn't fit a man in a flannel shirt. 2 reasons. The first is my leg and my back. A 5-hour flight crammed into a coach seat built for a smaller, younger, whole man is genuinely more than my body can take anymore. I'd have arrived unable to walk, and I needed to be able to walk to carry my wife to the water. But the second reason is the one that matters more. I had saved for this, for 2 years. Every spare dollar in a coffee can a little at a time. Because I had it in my head that this trip, the one trip that would ever mean this much, taking my baby to say goodbye to her mama at the edge of the sea, that this trip I would do it right. My girl would fly up front, just once in her life, like somebody special, because she is somebody special, and because her mother would have wanted her treated like a princess on the saddest, most important journey of her little life. 2 years of skipped lunches and patched boots so my Hazel could sit up front one time. That's what those 2 seats were. They weren't luxury. They were a promise to a dead woman and a gift to her grieving daughter paid for 1/4 at a time. I want you to picture that coffee can because it sat on top of my refrigerator for 2 years and it was just about the most sacred object in our little house. Every Friday, I'd put in what I could spare, which some weeks was $20 and some weeks was $2. Hazel knew it was the ocean fund, the going to see Mama's beach fund, and sometimes she'd drop in a few coins from her own little purse, very serious about it. And I never once told her no, even though it broke my heart a little every time, because a child shouldn't have to save up to say goodbye to her mother. I worked an extra shift where I could find one on a leg that didn't always want to cooperate. I fixed my own boots with shoe goo instead of buying new ones, and slowly, quarter by quarter, dollar by dollar, that can filled up. And the day I finally counted it out on the kitchen table and saw I had enough to do it right. Enough for the seats up front, I sat down in that kitchen chair and I cried like a baby because I'd done it. I'd kept the promise I was going to take my girls to the sea. That can is what that man in the suit tried to take. When he took our seats, he didn't know it, but that's what he was reaching for. So you'll understand that when we boarded and Hazel saw those big leather seats and her eyes went wide and she looked up at me like I'd hung the moon and whispered, "Daddy, is this really ours?" That was about the best moment I'd had in 2 years. I got her buckled in, got her little blanket, got her settled with her window, and I sat back in that seat with my ruined leg finally able to stretch out. And for about 10 minutes, I felt like I'd done something right. I felt like a good dad. I felt like maybe Mara was looking down and nodding. And then the trouble started. A gate agent came aboard, a young, sharp-dressed fellow with a tablet and a tight, impatient way about him. And he was talking to the lead flight attendant up front, and they kept glancing back at us. And then he came down to our row, and he crouched, and he said in a low voice that wasn't nearly as quiet as he thought, "Sir, I'm going to need to move you and your daughter today. We've got a seating situation up here." I said, "I'm sorry. Move us. These are our seats. I've got the tickets right here." And I started to get them out. And he gave me a look. You know the look. I've gotten it my whole life. The look that prices your flannel shirt and your cane and your kid's hand-me-down coat in about half a second and decides exactly how much you matter. And he said, "I understand, sir, but we have a passenger who needs to be seated in the cabin. And we're going to reaccommodate you and the child in the back. It's the most fair way to handle it. A passenger who needs to be in first class. More than us. More than a wounded man and a motherless little girl on the way to bury her mama. Some executive I'd find out later, some big account the airline didn't want to upset, who'd showed up late and wanted a first-class seat and didn't care which two people got thrown out of theirs to make room. And here's the thing I keep coming back to. They didn't pick a businessman to bump. They didn't pick somebody who looked like he could raise hell, somebody with a lawyer on speed dial. They looked down that first-class cabin, and they picked the two people they figured would be the least trouble. They picked the quiet man in the flannel shirt with the cane and the little kid. They picked us because we looked like we didn't belong up there anyway. Like we'd be grateful for whatever we got. Like nobody would make a fuss over us. They picked us because they looked at me and saw somebody who didn't matter. And the worst part, the part that put a knot in my throat I can still feel, was Hazel. She looked up at me confused, her little face starting to crumple, and she said, "Daddy, do we have to go? I thought these were our special seats." And what do you say to that? What do you say to your 7-year-old on the trip you saved 2 years for on the way to say goodbye to her mother when a man in a nice suit has just decided she's not worth a first-class seat? I'll tell you what I said. I leaned down and I smiled at her the best I could, and I said, "You know what, baby? Turns out the very best seats are in the back where you can see the whole plane. Let's go find them." Because the one thing I was not going to let that man take from my daughter was the joy of that day. He could have the seat. He was not getting her smile. So I stood up on my bad leg in that narrow space and I gathered our bags, and I took my little girl's hand and I got ready to walk us both to the back of that airplane with my head up, because I have walked through a lot worse than 300 staring strangers, and I was not going to give any of them the satisfaction of seeing me bend. But I'll be honest with you about what was happening on the inside, because the outside was a lie I was telling for Hazel's sake. On the inside, I was coming apart, not because of the seat. I've slept in mud. I've slept in worse than mud. A seat is a seat. It was that they'd done it in front of her. It was that I'd saved 2 years to give my daughter 1 day of feeling special on the hardest journey of her life, and a man with a tablet had erased it in 30 seconds and made her watch her father be treated like he didn't count. That's the thing that'll break a parent. Not what they do to you. What they do to you in front of your kid. What your kid learns watching about how the world sees her daddy. I could take the bump. What I couldn't take was the lesson it was teaching my little girl that some people matter and some people don't, and that her dad was the second kind. I would have crawled to the back of that plane on my hands and knees before I'd let that be the lesson. So I stood up straight and I smiled and I carried our bags, and inside I was praying. Actually praying. God, don't let this be the thing she remembers about today. What I didn't know, what I had no way of knowing, was that 2 people on that aircraft had been watching the whole thing and were not going to let it stand. The first was the flight attendant, a woman, maybe 50, who'd been working that front cabin and had seen and heard every bit of it. The bump, the look that gate agent gave me, my little girl's face, and I found out later that she'd noticed something the gate agent was too busy and too important to notice. She'd noticed my cane. She'd noticed the way I stood the way a man stands when half a leg is metal. She'd noticed the little challenge coin I keep clipped to my bag, the one from my unit, the one I never go anywhere without. And she'd seen when I pulled out the tickets the small laminated card I keep tucked in with them, my veteran's ID, and that flight attendant. God bless her, I never even got her name right, did not think it was right. So, while I was gathering our bags, she walked up to that cockpit and she knocked, and she told the captain exactly what was happening in his first-class cabin. And the captain, it turned out, was the second person who wasn't going to let it stand because Captain Ed Calder was a veteran too. I didn't know any of this yet, of course. All I knew was that I was halfway out of my seat bags in one hand, Hazel's hand in the other, when that cockpit door opened and the captain stepped out into the aisle. And the whole front of the plane kind of froze because the captain coming out of the cockpit during boarding is not a normal thing. He was an older man, gray at the temples with that calm, steady bearing. Some men carry their whole lives once they've earned it. And he didn't look at the gate agent. He didn't look at the flight attendant. He looked straight at me, at the tired, limping man in the flannel shirt being marched to the back of his airplane. And something moved across his face that I can only describe as recognition. Not of me personally, of what I was, of what that coin on my bag meant, and that cane, and that card. And then Captain had called her in front of 300 people came to attention in that narrow aisle, and he raised his hand in a slow, crisp textbook salute, and he held it on me, and he did not lower it, and the plane went absolutely silent. I want to tell you what that did to me standing there, because I wasn't ready for it. For 2 years, I'd been invisible. The wounded guy, the widower, the flannel shirt, nobody looks at twice. I'd gotten so used to being the man who doesn't matter that I'd half started to believe it. And here was this captain, this stranger standing at attention and holding a salute on me like I was somebody in front of the very people who just decided I was nobody. And I'll be honest with you, my eyes stung, and I had to swallow hard, and I did the only thing a soldier can do when an officer renders honors. I let go of my bag and I straightened up as best my body would let me, and I brought my own hand up and I returned his salute. 2 veterans, one in a captain's uniform and one in a flannel shirt, standing in the aisle of a commercial airplane honoring something most of the people around us couldn't even see. You have to understand what a salute is between soldiers, because it's not just a gesture. It's a whole language in one motion. It says, I see what you are. I see what you've carried. I know because I've carried some of it too. You are not invisible to me. When that captain held that salute on me, he was saying all of that without a word in front of every person who just decided I was nothing. And the thing that undid me wasn't pride. I'm not a proud man. The pride got burned out of me a long time ago. It was relief. It was the bone-deep relief of being seen after 2 years of being looked through on the one day I needed it most, in front of the one person I most needed to see it happen. There are moments in a life that crack you open, and standing in that aisle returning that old captain's salute with my daughter watching was one of mine. I have been given medals by generals. None of them ever reached me the way that one tired airline captain's salute did in a flannel shirt on the way to bury my wife. And then Captain Calder lowered his hand. And he walked down that aisle to me. And what he did next is the part I'll never forget as long as I live. He stuck out his hand to shake mine, and he said loud enough for that whole silent cabin to hear, "Sir, it is an honor to have you aboard my aircraft." And then he turned slowly. And he looked at that gate agent. And he looked at the executive in the nice suit who was standing there waiting to take my seat. And the temperature in that cabin dropped about 30 degrees. And the captain said, still calm, still quiet, but in a voice that carried to the back row, "This man and his daughter are not moving anywhere. They are exactly where they belong, and I think someone owes them an apology. Now, I didn't know the rest yet. I didn't know why this particular captain on this particular day had come out of that cockpit. I figured it was just one veteran honoring another, and that alone had undone me. But there was more. There was a reason Ed Calder had looked at the manifest when his flight attendant told him a wounded veteran named Boone was being thrown out of first class. There was a reason that name stopped him cold. But before I tell you that reason, let me tell you what happened to that gate agent and that executive, because I think you'll enjoy it as much as I did. God forgive me. The gate agent had gone pale. He started to stammer something about policy, about the seating situation, about how he was just following the process. And Captain Calder let him talk himself out. And then he said simply, "Your process just tried to remove a decorated combat veteran and his motherless child from seats they paid for to give them to a man who showed up late. That's not a process. That's a disgrace. Fix it. Now." And the executive in the nice suit, and I'll give him this, maybe he wasn't all bad, had clearly heard enough because he went red in the face and said, "It's fine. It's fine. I'll take another seat." I didn't. I had no idea. And he practically fled to the back of the plane himself, which I thought was the most decent thing he could have done at that point. And just like that, Hazel and I were put back in our seats. Our special seats. And the flight attendant who'd knocked on that cockpit door came and knelt down by Hazel and made a tremendous fuss over her, brought her a little pin, brought her extra cookies, treated my girl like the princess her mama wanted her to be. And Hazel, who 5 minutes earlier had been watching her father get humiliated, was now glowing like a light bulb, telling the flight attendant all about how we were going to see the ocean. And the whole cabin had changed around us. That's the thing. The same people who'd watched us get marched toward the back, who'd looked away the way people do when somebody's being humiliated and they don't want to be part of it. Those same people were sitting up now smiling at Hazel. A couple of them with wet eyes. An older gentleman across the aisle who reached over and shook my hand without a word and just nodded, the way old veterans do. A whole cabin of strangers who 30 seconds before had decided I was nobody, all rearranging themselves in real time around the truth. That's the thing about the truth. It doesn't argue. It just walks into the room and stands there, and everybody who was wrong about you has to quietly become right. Nobody apologized in words, most of them. But you could feel 300 people silently editing the story they'd told themselves about the limping man in the flannel shirt. And that's its own kind of apology, the kind that doesn't need saying. And I sat there in that big leather seat with my throat tight and my eyes wet. And I thought, Mara, I almost let them take it from her. And somebody I never met just gave it back. But I still didn't understand why. Not fully. Not until we were in the air an hour or so into the flight when Captain Calder did something pilots don't usually do. He had the lead flight attendant come back and ask if I'd be willing to come up and speak with him for a minute. And I went, of course, working my way up that aisle on my cane, and the captain had a few minutes on autopilot and the first off officer flying, and he half turned in his seat, and he looked at me, and the calm captain's mask was gone now. There were tears standing in this grown man's eyes, and he said, "Sergeant Boone, I need to tell you something, and I've been trying to figure out how to say it since I saw your name on my manifest." And I said, confused, "Sir." And he said, 3 years ago, the convoy, the ambush outside the wire, the vehicles that got hit, the man who went back into the fire, back into it 3 times and pulled wounded soldiers out of a burning vehicle while it was still under fire. That was you. And my blood went cold because, yes, that was me. That was the day I lost my leg. That was the worst day of my life, and the one I don't talk about, the one the medal in my drawer, is for the medal I've never once taken out to look at, because the men I remember from that day aren't all here to look at it with me. People think a medal for valor is a happy thing, a trophy, and I understand why they think that, but it isn't. Not for most of us who have one. A medal like that is a receipt. It's a record of the worst day of your life, the day that earned it, and every man I know who has one would hand it back in a heartbeat to undo the day it came from. Because I didn't go back into that fire to be brave. I want to be honest about that because the word hero gets thrown around and it embarrasses me. I went back in because those were my men, and they were screaming, and there was not one cell in my body capable of staying down while my men burned. It wasn't courage. It was that I'd rather have died than lived with not going. I got 2 of them out. I didn't get all of them. And that arithmetic, the ones I got, the ones I didn't, is what I carry every single day, heavier than the leg, heavier than anything. So when that captain said his son was one of the ones I got out alive with kids of his own, now he wasn't just thanking me. He was handing me for the first time in 3 years a piece of that day that didn't hurt. A name on the right side of the arithmetic. A boy who lived. You don't know what that's worth to a man who mostly only remembers the ones who didn't. I said quiet. How do you know about that, sir? And Captain Ed Calder's voice broke completely, and he said, because my son was in that vehicle. My son was one of the men you pulled out of the fire. My boy came home to me because you went back in when any sane man would have stayed down. You gave your leg getting my son out of that truck. I've spent 3 years not knowing your name, just knowing there was a sergeant who saved my boy. And then this morning, I'm doing a routine flight and my flight attendant tells me they're throwing a wounded veteran named Boone out of first class, and I look at the manifest, and he couldn't finish. He just put his hand over his mouth, and airline captain, this grown man, and his shoulders shook. And I stood there in the cockpit doorway, leaning on my cane, and I couldn't say anything either because the whole world had just gone strange and enormous. Of all the planes in all the country on the one trip I'd saved 2 years for, to take my wife home to the sea, I had walked onto the one aircraft in the sky being flown by the father of a man I'd pulled out of the fire. The boy I'd lost my leg for had a dad, and that dad was up front flying me to the ocean. You can call that coincidence if you want. I've stopped calling it that. I don't have a better word, but coincidence isn't it. I've turned it over 1,000 times since on long nights trying to make the odds of it work in my head, and they don't work. There are tens of thousands of pilots. There are millions of flights. For me to save by sheer chance the right 2 seats, 2 years in advance with money from a coffee can on the one airline, on the one route, on the one day, on the one aircraft flown by the one man in the entire sky who happened to be the father of a soldier. I carried out of a burning truck 3 years before. There's no math for that. I gave up on the math. I think some things in this life aren't accidents. I think Mara had a hand in it if you want to know what I really believe. I think she looked down at her grieving husband and her motherless girl saving up nickels to bring her home to the sea. And I think she pulled some strings that aren't ours to pull, and she made sure that on that flight of all flights, somebody was up front who'd stand up and show our daughter that her daddy mattered. You can believe that or not. I know what I believe. I believe my wife got us the right plane. The captain got himself together, and he gripped my hand, both of his, around mine, and he said, "My son is alive and well. He's got 2 kids of his own now, 2 kids who exist because of what you did. And I'm going to fly you and your daughter to that coast more carefully than I have ever flown anything in my life. It is the greatest honor of my career to have you in my airplane, Sergeant. You should never have been asked to stand up. Not on my aircraft. Not ever." And I made my way back to my seat past all those faces that had watched me get thrown out and then watched me get honored. And they were different faces now. And I sat down next to my little girl who was fast asleep with her head against the window and her hand in mine. And I looked out at the clouds and I had a long, quiet conversation with my wife that I'm not going to share with you, because some things are just between a man and the woman he's flying to the sea. Now here's the part you might be waiting for, the part about the airline making it right. Yes, they did. The captain saw to it. And so did corporate once word got up the chain. Because it turns out a story about throwing a decorated veteran and his motherless daughter out of first class is not the kind of story an airline wants going around. They refunded the whole trip. They gave Hazel and me lifetime travel benefits. First class, anywhere, which I'll mostly never use, but which I keep for one reason I'll tell you about in a minute. There were apologies, real ones and corporate ones. And that gate agent I made a point, actually, of asking that he not be fired. I did. People were surprised. But I've made enough mistakes in my life. And I've seen what it does to a young man to lose everything over one bad day. And I didn't want my wife's last journey to be the reason some kid lost his job. I wanted him to learn something, not to be destroyed. I hope he learned it. I think he might have. He wrote me a letter later that made me think he might have. But none of that, not the refund, not the benefits, not the apologies, none of that is the reward. I want to be real clear about that because if you've been with me on these stories before, you know how I feel about it. You don't do the right thing for a reward, and you sure don't get honored for a reward. And the day I went back into that fire, I wasn't thinking about anything but the men in that truck. The reward isn't anything the airline gave me. The reward was my daughter's face. Because here's the thing I haven't told you yet. Hazel saw all of it. She wasn't asleep for the part that mattered. My little girl, who had just watched her daddy get told he wasn't important enough for his own seat, who had seen me march toward the back of the plane like I was nothing. My little girl got to watch the captain of the whole airplane stand up and salute her father. She got to watch 300 people who'd looked away from us suddenly sit up and look at her dad like he was a hero. She got to hear later, when I felt she was old enough for a piece of it, that her daddy had done something brave a long time ago. Something that saved people's lives. Something that a grown man in a captain's uniform cried about. For 2 years, my daughter has watched her father struggle, watched me limp, watched me lose her mother and very nearly lose myself, watched the world look right past us. And on that one airplane, on that one impossible day, my little girl got to see her daddy honored, got to see that the quiet, broken man who makes her breakfast and braids her hair badly and saved for 2 years to take her to the ocean, got to see that that man mattered, that he was somebody, that the world just once stood up and saluted him. That's the reward. There isn't another one I'd trade for it. We made it to the coast. Captain Calder, true to his word, flew as smooth as glass, and when we landed he walked us off the plane himself, and he hugged Hazel and he shook my hand one more time and held it a long moment. 2 fathers who'd never have met if not for the worst day of my life, and he said, "Thank you, Sergeant, for my boy." And I said, "Thank you, Captain, for my girl." And that was that. We went to Mara's beach, the one where we slept in the truck a lifetime ago, and on a gray, quiet morning with the waves coming in soft, I held my daughter's hand and I carried my wife down to the water's edge, and the 3 of us went to the ocean together one last time. I won't tell you what Hazel said or what I said because it's hers and mine and her mother's, but I'll tell you that the sea took Mara home gentle, the way she'd have wanted, and that my little girl stood there in the surf and laughed through her tears, and that somewhere in there I felt something I hadn't felt in 2 years, which was peace. The kind that only comes when you've kept a promise that cost you everything to keep. Hazel asked me, standing there in the cold surf with her jeans rolled up, if Mama could see us, and I told her the truth as I understand it, which is, yes, baby, I believe she can, and I believe she's been seeing us this whole time, and I believe she's real proud of how brave you've been. And Hazel looked out at that gray ocean for a long moment, the way her mother used to, the exact same way. It stopped my heart a little, and she said, "Bye, Mama. I brought you home." 4 words from a 7-year-old, and they near about put me in the sand because that's what we'd done, the 2 of us, all that way. All those nickels in a can, all that pushing through. We brought her home. The little girl Mara made carried her mother back to the only place that ever quieted her mind, and gave her to the water, and said goodbye like a brave girl. There are not many moments in a life that you know while they're happening are the reason you were put on this earth. That was one of mine, standing in the surf with my daughter, keeping a promise to my wife. Everything else I've ever done, the war and the medal and all of it, I'd trade before I'd trade that gray morning at the edge of the sea. And those lifetime first-class benefits I told you, I keep for one reason. Here it is. Once a year on the anniversary, I take Hazel back to that beach. First class like her mama wanted. And every single time before we go, I check to see who's flying. Because Ed called me still up there, still flying. And a couple of times now, it's been his airplane. And a couple of times now his grandkids, the children of the boy I pulled out of the fire, have been waiting at the gate to meet us. Two families stitched together forever by the worst day of one of our lives going to the ocean. That's the only reason I keep those benefits. Not for the leather seats for the people they let me reach. Last spring it was Ed's plane again, and his son came too this time. The man himself, the one I pulled out of the truck, grown and healthy and gone a little gray at the edges like his daddy. He didn't say much, he didn't have to. He just hugged me at that gate for a long, long time, this big grown soldier. And over his shoulder I watched our kids, his two and my Hazel, chase each other around the seating area like they'd known each other all their lives, which in a way they have because they were all made possible by the same terrible holy day. And I thought, that's the arithmetic finally balancing. For 3 years all I could see was the column of the men I didn't save. And here at an airport gate were the children of a man I did running and laughing alive because a fellow in a flannel shirt once had a worse day than he could carry and carried it anyway. I'm still just a limping man in a flannel shirt. I'll never be rich. I'll never be important. And most days the world still looks right past me, and that's all right. I learned something on that airplane I already half knew but needed reminding of. That the world is full of people being looked right past, judged by a flannel shirt and a cane, and half a second by folks who have no earthly idea what that person has carried or given or lost. The gate agent looked at me and saw nobody. The captain looked at me and saw everything. The only difference between those two men was that one of them bothered to find out. There's a whole world of difference between the people who price your shirt and the people who ask your story. And I have decided for the rest of my life to try and be the second kind. That night after the beach, Hazel was getting sleepy in the hotel bed and she was quiet a long while. And then she said, "Daddy was that captain, right? Are you a hero?" And I thought about how to answer that the way you do, and I finally said, "No, baby. I'm just your dad. But a long time ago I had a real bad day, and I tried to do the right thing on it. And some good men came home because of it. That's all a hero is, I think. Just a regular person who tried to do the right thing on their worst day." And she thought about that, and she nodded, and then she said, "I'm going to do the right thing on my worst day too." And she fell asleep. And I sat there in the dark next to my sleeping girl, and I thought, well, Mara, there it is. That's the whole thing we were ever trying to give her. She's got it. She's going to be all right. So let me leave you with one thing to chew on before you go, because I truly love to hear from you on this one. That gate agent and the captain looked at the exact same man in the exact same flannel shirt, and one of them saw nobody to be shoved to the back, and the other saw a man worth saluting. And the only thing that separated them was whether they bothered to learn the story. So tell me down in the comments, when has somebody bothered to learn your story or the story of someone you'd written off and it changed everything? Who saw the real you when the world looked right past? I read every single comment that comes in, and stories like that are the reason I do this.